Welcome to our series on St. Matthew's Gospel. We are dealing with the fourth pillar of Matthew's Gospel, and we're in chapter 14. I said there were four different responses given to Jesus here as well. One was the people in Nazareth. Then we had Herod Antipas in all his sinfulness. And then we had the miracle of the loaves. And the people receive the bread. No understanding. Complete indifference. They will not change. That's this generation again, this very privileged generation who have the Lord himself in their midst, and he's feeding them with the manna from heaven in preparation for the true manna from heaven, and they cannot see it at all. This generation are actually very tragic. So the incident that follows this is an extremely important one, not only in Matthew's Gospel, but for the history of the church. And that is that from verse 22, we're told that directly after this, after the miracle of the loaves, Jesus made the disciples. In other words, he very strongly urged them to get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, and he would send the crowds away. Something very important here. At the beginning of the miracle of the loaves, the disciples said to Jesus, "Send the crowds away," because they've no food and they're going to have to look after themselves. Jesus said, "No, you look after them." Because the apostles did not realize that in this feeding of the loaves, that they were receiving their vocation to priesthood, and that they were going to have to feed the people of God, not only the Word of God for the rest of history, but also with the Eucharist. That was going to be their job, to feed the people and to take care of the spiritual needs of the people. That was going to be their task, and that they were going to have to do it sacrificially. In other words, it was going to have to be a gift from themselves. It was going to have to be something that would cost them. It would in fact cost them their lives. They would have to lay down their lives in the sense of living as celibate human beings and away from society so that they could be totally available for the Lord. So they didn't realize at the time that this was a very big part of their calling, and that they were to understand that Jesus was going to always be with them in the Eucharist, and that he was the author and the origin of the miracle, and they were the ones to feed the people, but they were feeding them with him as Word and him as Eucharist. That's what they were doing. But at this particular point, they don't understand that. So Jesus does something that they don't want to do. He tells them that they should get into the boat and go on the other side, but he's not going with them. Now, they don't want that at all. And they don't want it for several reasons. First of all, they don't want Jesus to do something with them not being around. That's the first thing. The second thing is the opposition to Jesus is getting greater and greater, and they're afraid for his safety. So they want to act as sort of bodyguards for him. He says, no, it's not going to work that way. And thirdly, they don't like him asking them to do something that they don't understand. We're all like that. We prefer to understand. Tell me why I'm being asked to do something and it'll be easier. And Jesus didn't tell them. He just told them to go. So it was even worse when he said, "I will send the crowds away." Because initially he said, "Don't send them." And as far as they're concerned, he's moving from one position to another, and he actually isn't. He's saying that the people can now go on their journey, because if they've been fed with the Word of God and they've been fed with the Eucharist, they can actually take their journey back to God with this heavenly food inside of them. And so now that he had fed them and they were strengthened and they were healed, of course, as well, they could go back home and continue their lives. So after sending the crowds away, Jesus went up onto the hills by himself to pray. Now, there's several layers in this story. I'm going to give you layer 1 first, because that'll make it easier. He went up to the hills to pray. Now, we're not told why he did this, but it's only when you go to the deeper layers you begin to get the message. When evening came, he was there alone while the boat was now far out on the lake. In other words, it had about 2/3 of the journey done. And it was battling with a heavy sea, and there was a headwind. So the apostles were having a hard time. Now, he wouldn't worry about that because the 4 fishermen were extremely experienced on the Lake of Galilee, and if anybody could handle boats, it would have been Peter. Okay, so he wouldn't worry about that necessarily. And he waited until the 4th watch of the night, which is about 3 o'clock in the morning. And then he went towards them walking on the lake. Now, don't forget the lake is all disturbed, and there's heavy seas and there's high winds, and he comes walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, and they said, "It's a ghost." Now, it's fascinating how quickly people will come to the conclusion that something is a ghost in the middle of the night. There's something to do with the night that switches us onto a different gear altogether. And because they're still thinking only of Jesus as a man, that's what we had with the Nazarenes. Where did the man get all this? And as far as Herod Antipas, he's just the man as well. And even the crowds who have received this miracle, they're only looking at him as the man. And unfortunately, the disciples are in the same boat. They have not yet penetrated the mystery of his person. And until they penetrate the mystery of his person, then they can't really be with him in every sense of the word. So they said it was a ghost. But they're standing on the waters of the Lake of Galilee just before dawn. It's still night. They see this glowing white figure because he's dressed completely in white. And they hear him saying, "Courage, it is I."
Don't be afraid. It is I.
Now, if I give you that in the original, ego eimi, these are the words that God said to Moses when Moses said, "What is your name? Who are you?" God said, ego eimi, I am.
I am that I am.
I am who I am. It is I. Don't be afraid. And when they realize that this is their Jesus, but in a completely different mode than they're used to, Peter decides to test whether this reality is true or not. And so Peter answered and he said, "Lord, if it is you," in other words, he has to discern whether it truly is the Lord or not, and not a ghost. He said, "If it is you, tell me to come to you across the water." Now, there's lots of time you could spend on that particular bit, but I don't have the time to do it. The first thing is, it's so outlandish for a human being to think that they could walk on water. He says, "If it really is you, you can tell me to do it." In other words, this is beyond belief. And the shock for him is when Jesus says, "Come. If you want to walk on water, I'm not having a problem. Just come." And I want you to hear the dead silence of the rest of them in the boat. They're not going to risk anything. They're looking at the high winds. They're feeling the high winds and they're looking at the high waves, and they're not going to risk life or limb at all. And so if Peter wants to make a complete fool of himself, okay, go. And I think one of the most incredible things you're told in the gospel is that Peter did in fact get out of the boat. This tells you something of the relationship that is between Peter and Jesus, and why it is that Jesus could actually trust this man. He would actually risk his life to reach Jesus. If it really is Jesus, he would risk his life to get there. Because stepping out onto those violently moving waters, and in that wind, it was taking his life in his hands. And it was only when he was actually standing on the water successfully that he realized what he was doing. And that was the mistake he made. He took his eyes off Jesus. When he was looking at Jesus, he could have walked on the water successfully. When he looked at the problem, he couldn't do it any longer. And there's a huge lesson for all of us there. And that is, the more you look at a problem, the more it increases. So you look down and you multiply the problem, look up and you magnify the Lord. If he had looked up, he would have walked successfully. So he sank. I always have a sneaking suspicion that the other 11 thought that the standard was getting too high if Peter was going to walk on water. So there would be a sigh of relief, you know. So he sank, and he's the only one in the 4 groups that respond to Jesus in chapter 14 that says the right thing. He said, "Lord, save me." Now that "save me" is not just take me out of this trouble that I'm in. It's save me at the absolute deepest level. And the extraordinary thing is that we're being shown here that it's only when we ourselves are in deep trouble or deep distress that we will cry out to the Lord from a deeper level than we've ever cried out before. We can have said, "Save me," from the lip level, which has no depth in it, or the heart level, which is a little bit deeper. But from your gut level, it's the deepest you that's actually crying out. And Jesus immediately reached out to him, and the 2 of them walked back successfully to the boat. Now, we never give Peter credit for walking back successfully hand in hand with Jesus. We only look at him sinking, which is very unfair. And we don't give him credit for getting out of the boat and risking his life, which is very unfair as well. Jesus said to him, the humor that is in the gospel is rarely seen by anybody, and I think it must be that they're not giving enough time to thinking it through. There's plenty of humor in the gospel. There's Peter up to his neck in water and in a stormy situation, and Jesus grabs hold of him, and before he pulls him out, he says, "Man of little faith, why did you doubt?" Before he actually pulls him out. I think that's fantastic. He doesn't wait until they get back into the boat and they're all safe and then say to him, "Man of little faith." He says it to him in the water. Okay. All the apostles are identified as men of little faith. They just could not break through to the mystery of Jesus' person, no matter what signs they saw. And sometimes they'd break through just for a moment and then they'd go back again. It's very much like ourselves. Sometimes we have a moment where maybe in prayer or in adoration, we break through just for a moment and realize whose presence we're really in. Most of the time, we don't do that. So Jesus said, "Why do you doubt?" And as they got back into the boat, the wind dropped.
Then they willingly took him into the boat.
So Jesus stopped the stormy weather as well. And at this point, Matthew says something very significant about these men. Okay, the men in the boat bowed down before him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is a major breakthrough for them. And the men needed to see Peter stepping out of the boat and failing, and Jesus' response to him, for them to realize what was really happening in their midst. So he revealed himself to them that he was divine, and they acknowledged for the first time. The next time that these words are going to be said is as soon as Jesus dies, and the executioner will say, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So this is a very, very important moment here, and it is a very important stage for the apostles as well. So let's go back and look at layer 2, because the second layer is even more important than the first layer, because all the boat scenes in the gospel, if you take the three synoptic gospels together, well, also John, because he has boat scenes at the end, all the boat scenes in the gospel are prophetic pictures of the church in the future. And they were telling you something about the church in the future. And the boat is the symbol of the church itself. The bark of Peter, we call the church. And the Sea of Galilee was a symbol of the Sea of Life. And it had two shores, the earthly shore and the heavenly shore. So they're always going from one to the other in the Gospels. And it's very important to look at the scenes in which Jesus is present in the boat and when he's not present in the boat, and what he's doing and what he's not doing. For example, when it was the storm, Jesus was asleep in the boat and they had to wake him up with their prayer.
Where is your faith?
Here Jesus isn't in the boat, and they're in the boat. So the first one that we did some time ago is that Jesus is present in the church, quietly present with us in the tabernacle, and we have to wake him up with our intercession to deal with the problems of everyday life in the church and in the world. Here's a different subject altogether. If Jesus is not in the boat, then this scene is not dealing with the early part of the church. It's dealing with the final glorious coming of Jesus at the end of time, when the church will be far out on the lake and Jesus has been in heaven ever living to make intercession for the church, which you read in Hebrews 7:25. And so it's a completely different thing altogether. Also, when you come to the other end of the gospel, when Jesus creates the Eucharist, he then goes into his passion and death. So he's not in the boat, if I can put it that way. He has gone up the mountain into God's presence. And it's after the resurrection that Jesus makes them get on with the mission, which is they've got to take the boat out into the world. And they appear not to have him. He's there, but he appears not to be present, because we now have his presence in a spiritual way and not in a physical way. Okay, so it's representing the church's journey. And when you're told that the boat is far out on the lake, we're dealing with a stage of church history where the church has been a long time. So that fits our position today. And what you're looking at is that there's a problem in the boat. And the problem in the boat is very simple. And if you put all the boat scenes together, this becomes even clearer than in this one particular scene. And that is that the church doesn't go into crisis if she is completely certain about who Jesus is in the Eucharist. But if she ever loses touch with Jesus in the Eucharist, she goes into a complete crisis. If we ever lose faith in the Eucharist, the boat goes down. We just are not able to manage. And so what we're told is that at a certain point in history, we don't know the point because we're not told this, that Jesus will come, walk through the night of history, walking on the turbulent waters of our society in history. And he will reveal himself to the church. It is truly me. You have truly had God all the time in your presence. I truly am who I said I was. I am divine as well as human. But the church will have been so long on this journey that they will wonder, is this reality or not reality? And it is up to the Peter of the time, that is the Pope at the time, to go out and test whether this returning person truly is Jesus or not. And we're told that Peter, whoever it is at the time, will have to risk his life and risk his reputation and risk everything to test that this returning person truly is the Christ. And when he walks back triumphantly with Christ into the church, that the whole church will fall in worship and realize in a way we've never realized it before that Jesus not only was with us all the time, but he truly, absolutely is the Son of God. And so any of these boat scenes that are given to us in the gospel, they're given to us to tell us not only what was happening at the time of Christ, but to tell us that these are prophetic forecastings of what will happen in the future as well. Of course, the scenes are given to us to tell us about the past as well. And that is that when you read Psalm 77, verses 18 and 19, only God can walk the sea. Only God can control the sea. When you read Psalm 107, which is telling us about all the trials and difficulties in life, one of the sections of Psalm 107 tells us about a storm on the lake, and only God can control the storm on the lake and can bring the sailors who are absolutely terrified by the danger of death to bring them calmly to their shore. And so everybody gets so caught up in what's happening to Peter in this incident that they forget, A, Jesus came in the middle of a storm. They forget that. There was high winds and there was high seas. They forget that. Jesus came when there was a crisis among the disciples. They forget that. Peter was the one who risked his life to try and find out what was really going on. And it was Peter who triumphantly brought Jesus back into the boat. This is the man to whom Jesus will entrust the church. You are my Peter. You are my continuator. This man who would risk his life to try and find the truth. But also, you're being told that Peter and the apostles are perfectly ordinary people like the rest of us, and they also have their struggles and they also have their difficulties. And we have to pray for them, and they also have to be saved in their own lives, okay? But truly, you are the Son of God is a fantastic way to finish this, okay? At the end of chapter 14, we have just a very short piece where Jesus continues healing people, but not teaching them. The teaching, the public teaching, has stopped. And it's only when that's pointed out to you that you realize everything has changed in the gospel. Having made the crossing, they came to the land of Gennesaret. Now, they've had this extraordinary experience on the sea, and then they land. And when the local people recognized him, they spread the news through the whole neighborhood, and they took all that were sick to him. See, he was very useful. It's very useful to have somebody around who can heal the sick, and they don't have to be going to doctors and medicine and spending lots of time trying to get better or anything else. And if somebody can just heal you like that, you don't have to look as to why I'm sick. And so Jesus was very handy. He has to stop, and he will become very careful about who he reaches out to. They took all that were sick to him, begging him to just let them touch the fringe of his cloak, and all those who were touched it were completely cured. Now, that's the way Jesus treated the crowds at the very beginning, when he was trying to tell them that the Lord is in your midst, that the Lord has come to you with great compassion, he's come to you with great understanding, he has come to you in mercy. So you see that there are various stages of growth going on all the time. And that's the way it is throughout history. Some people are at the very beginning of their journey. Some people are more advanced. Some people have made it all the way to the kingdom of God. And these layers are there in the church all the time. Some people at various stages of the church. And we just have to accept that. Sometimes when we see that God uses a certain person to just simply heal others, we can misunderstand and not realize that the people who are being reached out to are the ones who must begin their journey to come to him. Thank you for listening. Slán agus banach dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
Each one of us is on a journey. Some of us are on the journey of growing up, Some of us are in education. Some of us are falling in love, going to work, struggling with unemployment or ill health. We all need to have the scriptures open to us. We all need to encounter Jesus on the road. I really warmly welcome the work of Shalom World Television. Thank you for the way in which you assist in the mission of the church, helping them to come to terms with the eternal truth as it applies in their lives, whatever their journey. And I extend my blessing to you and to all your viewers, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Shalom World, God's own channel.